In December 1941, the Russian steppe began consuming what had been the most formidable military force ever assembled. Temperatures dropped to 30 degrees below zero. Wind dragged heavy snow across ice-choked fields. Synthetic lubricant in tank engines congealed into thick paste. The massive steel tracks of Panzers froze solid to the ground overnight. When drivers attempted to move them forward, transmission gears screamed and snapped. Operation Typhoon, the German drive on Moscow, had stalled in the ice. For the 2nd SS Panzer Division, the crisis was just beginning. These men were the ideological vanguard of the regime, trained for total war. They had marched through Poland with discipline, broken through the Grebbe Line in the Netherlands, and swept through France. But the Russian winter operates on thermodynamics alone. It recognizes no ideology. In the trenches, these were no longer parade ground soldiers. Their uniforms provided no protection against the wind. They wrapped themselves in stolen peasant rags and the coats of dead men. Frostbite blackened their fingers until they couldn't feel rifle triggers. Men froze to death after sitting too long in the snow. The scale of casualties defied comprehension. The Der Führer Regiment, a core component of this elite division, crossed the Soviet border with 2,000 highly trained troops. By early 1942, they had been reduced to 35 combat-effective men, 2,000 soldiers, reduced to 3 dozen. The rate of attrition shattered any notion of invincibility. Prussian discipline couldn't overcome a blizzard. Fanaticism meant nothing against Soviet snipers and millions of Red Army soldiers launching counteroffensives. The division appeared finished by every military metric, scattered squads waiting for artillery to finish them. But they were pulled from the line instead. What followed defies conventional military logic. A shattered division, with just 35 men remaining in its premier regiment, would transform into one of the most feared armored units of the war. To understand this transformation, we need to step back from the Eastern Front and examine the broader European theater. In 1934, Germany's cobblestone streets echoed with marching boots. The regular German army, the Heer, watched the birth of the SS Verfügungstruppe with institutional suspicion. These professional officers, steeped in centuries of military doctrine, saw something different. The SSVT was entirely political, a paramilitary force fanatically loyal to the Führer, operating outside military law. They wore black uniforms but lacked the tactical discipline that defined the Wehrmacht. Aristocratic generals dismissed them as glorified bodyguards playing soldier. They doubted these political zealots could fight a modern mechanized battle. The outbreak of war shattered that assumption. By 1939, this political experiment was thrown into combat and evolved rapidly. Beginning as motorized infantry in Poland, they displayed shocking aggression on the front lines. They didn't retreat. They assaulted fortified positions with an intensity regular army units couldn't match. They swept through the Netherlands in 1940, broke the Grebbe Line, and pushed through France. The generals stopped laughing. By 1943, this scorned collection of political extremists had become the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich. But 1943 was fundamentally different from 1939. The lightning victories of early Blitzkrieg were over. The dream of rapid European conquest had evaporated on the Eastern Front. Germany's strategic reality had shifted. No longer a predator hunting at will, Germany was bleeding from self-inflicted wounds. The war had transitioned from unstoppable offense to desperate defensive attrition. The Reich's borders buckled under combined pressure. Battle maps in Berlin no longer showed organized lines pushing outward. They displayed chaotic webs of red arrows pointing inward. Gaps tore open in German defensive lines from the Russian steppe to the beaches of France. The Wehrmacht lacked the manpower to defend an entire continent. Numerically overwhelmed, they needed a specialized unit that could surge to points of maximum crisis rather than hold fixed positions. This strategic collapse produced the Feuerwehr doctrine, the Fire Brigade doctrine. Das Reich became a heavily armored rapid response force. Designated as a mobile emergency reserve, they were High Command's panic button. When Soviet armored columns broke through regular army sectors, Das Reich scrambled. 60-ton Tiger and Panther tanks were loaded onto rail transport and rushed across Europe, from partisan ambushes in the Balkans to the hedgerows of Normandy and back to Russia. They arrived at crisis points, detrained into combat, and used speed, armored weight, and surprise to hit enemy flanks. They scattered breakthroughs, restored lines in storms of fire, then immediately loaded back onto trains for the next disaster. It was an exhausting mechanical existence. The immaculate black uniforms of early parades were gone. These were hollow-eyed veterans caked in mud, smeared with grease, smelling of cordite, elite armored units of a shrinking German perimeter. But a fire brigade requires the best equipment. To halt enemy armored breakthroughs, they needed heavy steel, deadly long-range guns, and reliable engines. Das Reich demanded priority for every machine rolling off German assembly lines. But German industry was collapsing under relentless Allied bombing. Factories were pulverized, supply lines were severed. The Aryan supremacists who viewed the world as racially inferior suddenly lacked the tools to enforce their supremacy. Their country couldn't supply the steel they needed to survive. Stranded without adequate tanks, facing annihilation while their vaunted industry failed them, they rejected defeat. Instead, they turned to the crude machinery of their inferior enemy and decided to steal it. In early 1943, the Eastern Front disintegrated into frozen mud and shattered concrete. The German military reeled from Stalingrad. The southern sector threatened collapse. Das Reich was thrust back into the inferno of Kharkov, the air-choked lungs with pulverized brick, burning oil, and frozen blood. They fought a savage counter-offensive, bleeding for every ruined block, slaughtering through roofless houses to retake the city. They succeeded and reclaimed the ruins, but victory tasted like ash. When the smoke cleared and artillery faded, the division stood isolated in a graveyard. They held Kharkov, but their armored strength was gutted. Their engineered panzers lay scattered across the steppe, blackened iron coffins. The reality struck division command hard. They were supposed to be elite, the fire brigade designed to save the German army. But a fire brigade without equipment is just men waiting to burn. They needed armor to hold against the coming Soviet counterstroke. Commanders demanded Panzer replacements from Berlin. The response was silence. No tanks were coming. German industry couldn't deliver. Factories in the Ruhr were being pounded by Allied bombers. Rail lines were severed. Supply chains were broken. For the proud officers of Das Reich, indoctrinated to view themselves as military perfection, this was profound humiliation. The master race was stranded. The political soldiers were left exposed on the most brutal battlefield in human history. Desperation bred ruthless innovation. SS combat troops scouring the bombed-out industrial sectors of Kharkov stumbled upon a sprawling complex, the Kharkov tractor plant. Before the war, this facility had been a testament to Soviet industrial might. Now it appeared to be a shattered husk of twisted steel and collapsed concrete. Russian wind howled through jagged holes in the factory walls. Combat engineers picked through rubble, expecting only scrap metal. But deep inside the ruined factory, beneath collapsed beams, they found a functional heavy industrial workshop that had survived bombardments. It wasn't a German workshop. It was alien. It was designed to mass-produce the machine German infantry had learned to fear, the T-34 medium tank, the rugged, sloped armor beast that had been destroying their panzers since summer 1941. Here was the war's central paradox. The Reich's most ideologically pure division, men indoctrinated to believe in Slavic genetic inferiority, were forced to look to a Soviet machine for survival. The SS elite saw their burning panzers, then the Soviet presses. They realized survival depended on the engineering of the enemy they were trying to exterminate. They made an unprecedented decision. If the fatherland couldn't provide tools of war, they would build their own. They established the SS Panzerwerk directly inside the Russian tractor plant. But German tank commanders didn't know how to build Soviet machines. They needed the hands that had forged them originally. Armed SS troops scoured prisoner camps and ruined streets, pulling out 15 to 20 Soviet captive engineers, men who understood the casting, welding, and mechanics of the T-34. Under threat of execution, these starving captives were forced onto the factory floor. The SS Panzerwerk became an industrial operation rising from ashes. Nazi overseers and enslaved Soviet specialists formed a desperate alliance. The atmosphere was thick with tension and the metallic smell of ozone. Sparks cascaded from welding torches, illuminating hollow faces working in perpetual gloom. The SS didn't build fresh tanks from scratch. They used recovery vehicles to drag destroyed, burnt-out Soviet T-34 carcasses off the battlefield and haul these steel corpses into the plant. Their motto was ruthless and practical. Of three, let us make one. It was mechanized autopsy. Pneumatic wrenches and cutting torches screeched off concrete walls as captive engineers tore apart dead armor. They stripped V-2 diesel engines, intact turrets, and wide tracks from destroyed tanks, then grafted these scavenged parts together to create functional machines. The contrast on the factory floor was stark. Sharp, tailored, arrogant SS officers wearing death's head insignia stood over massive, rough-cast, dark green hulls of Soviet steel. The T-34 was not beautifully engineered. It was crude. It left the factory with ugly weld seams across the turret. The steel was rough to touch, built for brutal mass efficiency with zero regard for crafted perfection. Yet, the proud master race was forced to swallow its pride and admit the stopping power of this sloped armor. They watched as enslaved workers finished the hulls. Then came the final contradiction. German supply soldiers stepped forward with white and black paint. On the sloped, rough-cast, green armor of the resurrected Soviet beast, they meticulously stenciled the crisp, geometric lines of the German Balkenkreuz, the Black Cross, a Soviet weapon wearing a Nazi uniform. Out of the smoke and sparks of the SS Panzerwerk in Kharkov, a new armored formation was born. The 3rd Panzer Battalion of the Das Reich Panzer Regiment, an elite, ruthlessly trained SS unit equipped exclusively with 25 to 50 heavily modified, resurrected Soviet T-34s. The arrogant SS tank commanders who had scoffed at Soviet engineering as primitive were forced to abandon their beloved Panzers. They climbed the uneven steel sides of captured T-34s and dropped into the dark, claustrophobic, oil-stained belly of the Soviet beast. To these tank aces, this felt like betrayal. Shedding their mechanical identity to stay alive, riding into battle in the armor of the demon they were sent to destroy. But as these veterans settled into uncomfortable Soviet seats and grabbed stiff steering levers, they realized something critical. The T-34 was powerful and protective, but it was practically blind, structurally deaf, a blunt, uncoordinated instrument. German commanders knew brawn wasn't enough to survive against millions of vengeful Soviet troops. They couldn't simply drive a stolen tank. They had to change its mechanical DNA. They had to transform a crude Soviet tractor into a hybrid apex predator. They had to weaponize Soviet brawn with German brains. Climbing into the T-34 747R, Beutepanzer assaulted the senses. The interior was a metal drum devoid of the ergonomic comforts of German panzers. Steel walls were cold and jagged. The smell of machine oil, stale sweat, and exhaust fumes permeated everything. When the Soviet V-2 diesel engine roared to life, it didn't purr like the smooth Maybach gasoline engines SS crews knew. It thumped. It delivered heavy, rhythmic vibration through metal floorboards into the bones of the packed crew. The engine was a brutal masterpiece of Soviet industrial torque, powerful, reliable, and far less prone to catastrophic fires when hit by armor-piercing shells. But inside the German military machine, this diesel heart was logistical poison. The entire German war machine ran on gasoline. Every supply truck, armored car, Tiger and Panther tank relied on a continuous river of high-octane gasoline. Running an elite diesel unit inside a gasoline army required a dedicated, complex supply chain. It strained Das Reich's logistics to breaking point. Fuel trucks had to be sanitized. Specialized diesel drums had to be dragged thousands of miles across a frozen, partisan-infested continent, creating a supply bottleneck just to keep these 50 stolen beasts moving. But SS mechanics endured this logistical agony because the stopping power of thick, sloped Soviet armor was irreplaceable. Yet they knew heavy armor was meaningless if the crew inside was blind and isolated. The original Soviet T-34 was a terrifying predator that went into battle practically blindfolded. The turret was a steel vault, lacking a dedicated commander's cupola. To command an armored battle, The Soviet tank commander had to open the heavy turret hatch and expose his head and shoulders to shrapnel and sniper fire just to see the enemy. German mechanics of the SS Panzerwerk refused to accept this flaw. They tore cutting torches into the steel roof of captured Soviet turrets and amputated the top hatch. In its place, they welded the sophisticated commander's cupola, salvaged from destroyed Panzer III and IV tanks. This single modification changed the machine's tactical genetics. The German commander gained protected, 360-degree panoramic vision. He remained sealed inside thick armor, safe from shrapnel, while his eyes swept the battlefield through bullet-resistant glass vision blocks. But a commander who could see still needed his gunner to kill cleanly. The crude, cloudy Soviet gun sights were ripped from turret mountings and replaced with German Zeiss optical glass. The sensory difference was staggering. The German gunner leaned against the breech of the Soviet 76mm gun. As he pressed his eye against the cold Zeiss glass, the chaotic, blurred environment snapped into crisp, high-definition focus. German optical lenses drastically multiplied long-range hit probability. They transformed a blunt, close-quarters Soviet brawler into a precise, lethal sniper rifle capable of punching through enemy armor before the enemy realized they were under fire. But sharp eyes were useless without a clear voice. The T-34's most fatal flaw wasn't its engine or gun. It was its primitive communication network. Most Soviet tank units relied on flag signals waving from open turret hatches or unreliable, weak 10RT radio sets. They were fundamentally deaf. When battle descended, and thick smoke obscured flags, individual Soviet tanks lost tactical cohesion. They scattered across the steppe like a disorganized herd, unable to coordinate concentrated attacks. SS mechanics tore out every piece of primitive Soviet wiring and gutted the internal communication system. In its place, they installed the sophisticated, powerful German Fug-5 transceiver system, a robust 10-watt transmitter and receiver. The dark interior suddenly filled with the low crackle of static over newly wired internal intercoms. German crews no longer had to scream over the roar of the V2 diesel. They spoke in calm, measured tones through throat microphones. More importantly, the antenna on the turret connected the machine to an invisible web of instant tactical communication. This single upgrade unleashed the terror of German military doctrine known as Auftragstaktik, decentralized command. Armed with Fug-5 radios, an elite SS platoon of 4 or 5 Budapanzer T-34s didn't operate rigidly. They operated like an interconnected pack of mechanized wolves. They talked constantly. They relayed spotting coordinates. They coordinated flanking crossfires in blinding blizzards. Because they could communicate flawlessly, this small group of hijacked Soviet steel could outmaneuver, outflank, and dismantle swarms of numerically superior yet blind Soviet armor. They achieved localized tactical superiority, not through numbers, but through instant intelligence. The hybridization continued on the exterior. While the T-34's sloped armor deflected incoming solid shot brilliantly, the wide tracks and road wheels remained vulnerable to cheap, mass-produced infantry anti-tank rifles. German mechanics used welding torches to graft thick sheets of German armored plating along the exposed flanks. This was the implementation of Schritzen, armor skirts. They widened the machine's profile, hanging over the tracks like steel plates of a Roman gladiator. When a Soviet anti-tank round slammed into the side, the Schritzen detonated the kinetic energy early, shattering the incoming projectile before it could cut the tracks and paralyze the tank in mud. But the ultimate layer of protection wasn't made of steel or glass. It was made of cloth. Tank crews climbing from their hatches no longer wore pristine black uniforms. They were the testbed for revolutionary infantry camouflage. Das Reich introduced the Plattenmuster, or plain tree pattern, a highly disruptive reversible camouflage smock designed to break apart the human silhouette. It wasn't a fashion statement. It was a tactical advantage. When elite SS Panzer Grenadiers dismounted to clear trench lines, the advanced blotch pattern absorbed them into the chaotic, broken terrain of the Eastern Front. They became a ghost-like force, materializing from foliage, unleashing short-range fire, and vanishing back into the visual noise of woods before the enemy could react. The combination of the reliable Soviet chassis, Thick sloped armor, Zeiss optics, decentralized radio command, and tactical camouflage created lethal synergy. This wasn't theoretical advantage on a map. The reality of this hybrid predator was measured in burning steel. No one demonstrated the killing power of this stolen beast better than SS Hauptscharfer Emil Siebold. A hardened veteran integrated into the 3rd Panzer Battalion, he commanded one of these modified T-34s through the massive armored clashes of summer 1943. He didn't just survive the Eastern Front, he dominated it. Within a single summer, Siebold accumulated 69 confirmed kills. He stalked the battlefield, peering through German glass, calling targets over German radio, and pulling the trigger of the Soviet gun. He used the enemy's own weapon to destroy 69 of their machines, proving that the fusion of Soviet muscle and German brains created the most lethal tank on the battlefield. Das Reich had achieved mechanical superiority. They had proven combat brilliance in the harshest conditions of modern warfare. They had taken broken remnants of a freezing army and forged them into a technically flawless spearhead. The fire brigade doctrine had succeeded brilliantly on the tactical map. But this tactical achievement was a dangerous illusion. The men looking through those Zeiss lenses weren't merely soldiers fighting a defensive war. They were the ideological shock troops of a genocidal empire. The tactical superiority they had engineered wasn't used strictly against armed combatants. The violence they had perfected on the Eastern Front was contagious. It didn't stop at battlefield edges. The weapons they had honed would be turned against humanity itself. The mechanical triumph of the armor was about to give way to a horrifying moral abyss. The division's military mythos was about to drown in civilian blood. The official wartime propaganda posters distributed by the Ministry of Public Enlightenment showed airbrushed faces of elite Panzer commanders staring boldly into the distance. German High Command desperately wanted and actively manufactured a noble military mythos for the 2nd SS Panzer Division. They marketed Das Reich as a brotherhood of heroic armored knights, holding back an apocalyptic tide. Officially, they pointed to the staggering number of medals pinned to tailored tunics. The division is historically recorded as one of the highest decorated formations in Third Reich history. Between 72 and 90 of its men were awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, an intimidating statistical testament to their supposed military supremacy. But beneath the glossy veneer of propaganda reels, the dates stamped on those iron crosses tell a different story. The vast majority of these awards weren't handed out during the sweeping victories of early war. They were handed out in a frantic flurry during the final 2 catastrophic years of the collapsing regime. It wasn't a pure measurement of tactical brilliance. It was manufactured propaganda. As strategic reality became impossible and regular Wehrmacht divisions collapsed across hundreds of miles of retreating front lines, Nazi leadership deliberately showered the Waffen-SS with exaggerated medals. They needed to project an illusion of unbreakable elite strength to a terrified German populace. The elite status of Das Reich in 1944 was, in large part, a deliberate lie designed to hide the blood-soaked reality of a dying, retreating army. And the division's reality was soaked in innocent blood. To understand the true legacy of Das Reich, you cannot simply count the Soviet tanks they destroyed, or marvel at the technological ingenuity of their communications networks. You must confront the horrifying moral abyss they created. The ruthless tactical aggression they engineered for armored combat didn't stop neatly at battlefield edges. It translated seamlessly into a systematic, industrial policy of mass murder. They applied the same mechanical efficiency they used to dismantle enemy armor to the wholesale slaughter of unarmed civilians. They called it Bandenbekämpfung, gang suppression. But it wasn't counterinsurgency. It was an extermination program clad in sloped armor. This ideological programming didn't suddenly appear at war's end. It was foundational. It started early, rooted in the frozen, blood-soaked dirt of the Eastern Front. In September 1941, the division was stationed near occupied Minsk. They weren't fighting armed Red Army soldiers. A support unit of this elite combat formation integrated seamlessly with the mobile extermination squads of Einsatzgruppe B. Together, these trained, heavily armed military professionals executed 920 Jewish men, women, and children. They looked through the same Zeiss optical glass that would later target tanks to aim rifles into the backs of terrified civilians standing at the edge of freshly dug pits. This was the crucible. The Eastern Front conditioned the men of Das Reich to view all civilian populations not as non-combatants, but as subhuman targets for immediate erasure. When the division was transferred back to the West in 1944 to repulse the Allied invasion of Normandy, they brought this imported radicalization into the heart of France. Their northward march toward the collapsing beaches wasn't just a military convoy. It became a documented geographical trail of blood. Modern historians have meticulously mapped their route through the French countryside and calculated the scale of horror. There are an estimated 124 separate documented locations of brutal atrocities committed by this single division in France alone. Every time the French resistance harassed their supply columns or delayed fuel trucks, the armored division didn't respond with calculated military precision. They responded with the savage fury of a cornered beast. On June 9, 1944, elements of the division rolled into the quiet French town of Toul. They were ordered to break the spirit of the local population by making a terrifying example. They succeeded. Armed SS troops systematically rounded up the unarmed male population. They didn't shoot them in a hidden forest. They dragged them to the center of town. 99 men were brutally, methodically hanged from wrought iron residential balconies and ornate street lamp posts of the main avenue. Their bodies were left twisting in the warm summer breeze as the heavy tanks rolled out of town. But the horror of Toul was merely a prelude. The next day, June 10th, veterans of the Dörfer Regiment arrived at the peaceful village of Oradour-sur-Glane. Led by SS Sturmbannführer Adolf Diekmann, a man who wore his Iron Cross with pride, they surrounded the perimeter. They forced the entire population into the town square and separated the men from the women and children. This wasn't a chaotic battle. It was a perfectly executed administrative slaughter. They locked 247 women and 205 young children inside the stone walls of the village church. Then these elite, tactically brilliant soldiers of the Third Reich deployed incendiary devices. 642 innocent civilians were burned alive. The dark smoke of the burning village reflected in the pristine lenses of waiting German optics. Today, Oradour-sur-Glane stands untouched, a stark, silent, roofless ruin. A permanent physical scar burned into the earth, perfectly preserving the moment a highly trained Panzer division lost its humanity. When the war ended and Europe lay in ashes, the shattered remnants of Das Reich were crushed. But the historical closure of the division is not a story of righteous justice. It's a story of legal evasion and infuriating injustice. In 1953, the international legal system attempted to prosecute the perpetrators of the Oradour massacre in a highly publicized trial in Bordeaux. But the trial didn't deliver closure. It tore French national identity apart. Out of 21 SS men in the docks, 14 were not German. They were French Alsatians, the Malgré-nous, young men from disputed border regions who had been forcibly conscripted into the Waffen-SS against their will. The victims' families demanded the guillotine. But the region of Alsace threatened political revolt if their stolen sons were executed for a crime they were forced to participate in. The legal crisis paralyzed the country. Within days of the convictions, the fractured French parliament passed a blanket amnesty law. The bureaucratic ink erased the sentences. The perpetrators, wearing the familiar faces of their victims' own countrymen, unlocked their cells and walked freely into the sun. The murderers escaped. The legal compromise shattered the victims' families forever. The defining image of the 2nd SS Panzer Division is not a heroic tank battle in snow or a brilliant mechanical modification in a ruined factory. The final image occurs decades later. The year is 1971. The location is a quiet, manicured civilian cemetery in the wealthy West German city of Düsseldorf. A successful, respected, wealthy building contractor is laid to rest. His name is Heinz Lammerding. He was the divisional commander of Das Reich during the horrific summer of 1944. He had been condemned to death in absentia by a French court for the massacres in Toul and Oradour. But the post-war West German constitution prohibited extradition of its own citizens. He lived his entire life in luxurious freedom, protected by the very international laws he had violated. Surrounding his open grave stands an eerie, disturbing sight. Over 200 old men stand silently in the open air. They wear sharp, well-tailored business suits from the early 1970s. They are businessmen, architects, and grandfathers. But beneath the expensive fabric, they carry the dark secrets of genocide. They are the surviving veterans of Das Reich. They stand together proudly, openly mourning the architect of a slaughter. The ideological bonds forged in the freezing mud of Russia and cemented in the burning streets of France remain unbroken. They don't hide in shame. They stand in daylight. Das Reich was not a noble military vanguard. They were the quintessential realization of the political soldier, a grotesque historical anomaly. Their legacy proves a haunting truth, that human beings are capable of combining the highest peaks of mechanical genius, tactical evolution, and battlefield courage, with the deepest, darkest depths of unapologetic human cruelty.